It's beginning to look a lot like a diplomatic standoff. For days, China warned Canada of, quote, grave consequences should this country not release Huawei's CFO, who was arrested in Vancouver. Now, a former Canadian diplomat has been detained in China. Who is Michael Kovrig? Here's what we know. Kovrig served as a Canadian diplomat from 2003 to 2016, spending most of his time in Beijing and Hong Kong. He actually served as political lead on the Prime Minister's visit to Hong Kong in September of 2016. Kovrig now works for the International Crisis Group as a senior advisor on security issues in Northeast Asia. Most recently, in October, he's quoted in the Miami Herald saying, U.S.-China relations have deteriorated to their worst point since the 1989 Tiananmen Square pro-democracy protests in Beijing. So, should Canada consider Kovrig's detention a retaliation for the December 1st arrest of Meng Wanzhou? Meng is Huawei's chief financial officer. She's also the daughter of the company's founder. Guy Saint-Jacques served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016, and he worked with Michael Kovrig. He's now a senior fellow at the University of Alberta's China Institute. I spoke with him earlier this afternoon. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for the invitation.
I appreciate it. So I understand that you did know Mr. Kovrig. What can you tell us about who he is and what might have led to this event?
Well, Michael is a career diplomat who came to work at the embassy in 2014. So I had the pleasure of working with him for 2 years. He was in the job that we call the GSRP job, which means that he was a political officer doing some detailed analysis of what was going on in China. And typically, the officer in that position has a budget to be able to travel around. So as a result, they traveled to Xinjiang, a number of other places. He used to be a journalist, so he is someone with a good analytical sense. He produced great reports that were really appreciated throughout Ottawa, great insights. Of course, he dealt with issues that were sensitive because he met with people that were, like when you meet with dissidents, this get the attention of the Chinese security establishment. And at the end of his posting in 2016, he told me that he loves China so much that he would want to stay on. And what was my advice? I said, well, I can understand that you love this country, you love the work, and so maybe the best advice I can give you is take a leave of absence, find a job, and after a few years you can decide whether you want to come back. But I was really hoping he would come back to global affairs because he is a great political officer.
So from your viewpoint, is there a possibility that he is, if he did take that leave, that he would still then be a public servant?
Well, in theory, technically, he could still be, and it's something that, in fact, Global Affairs will probably confirm whether he's still on the books. But again, this was a first-quality officer. He speaks Mandarin, and he was now going regularly to China, based in Hong Kong with the International Crisis Group.
Is there any way, from your perspective, that his detainment is not related to what we've seen unfold over the past few weeks with Huawei?
Well, to tell you the truth, I would be really surprised by this, and it's based on my experience in China. In China, there's no coincidence, and I've seen this many times when things happen, and if they want to send you a message, they will send you a message. In this case, it's all related, in my view, to the leadership, to the strategy presently pursued by the Chinese leadership to put as much political pressure as possible on the Canadian government, and it's related, obviously, to the case of Mrs. Meng. This being said, I was saddened to learn that Michael was detained, and because I know what kind of process he is getting in, which harsh
What
detention.
kind of process is it? Yeah.
Well, I dealt a lot with the Garrett case, and so he will be subject to lengthy interrogation sessions. The detention conditions will be minimal. He will probably be in a jail with 20 other people. And unfortunately, Michael knows this because he was at the embassy when we were dealing with the Garrett case and trying to get them out of China. But again, I was surprised because I would have expected that China would take this step a bit down the road. I thought that they would start by canceling maybe ministerial visits. I know that Minister Joly was supposed to go to China to conclude the 2018 Canada-China Year of Tourism. She was supposed to go these days, so I don't know if this is still on. The annual dialogue between the Foreign Affairs Minister has not taken place, nor the national security and rule of law dialogue. And if I were Chinese, I would say let's proceed with this, because the last one, the national security and rule of law dialogue, would be the forum to raise their views on the Meng case. But now it just brings another dimension to the relationship, which will really complicate it will complicate the relationship over the next few months and years, I'm afraid.
Why do you think China is taking this drastic of a step so early on? What message are they trying to send from where you sit?
Well, unfortunately, I would say we are dealing with what I call the new China, which is a China under President Xi Jinping that is a lot more assertive, aggressive, blunt, where they want to dictate how you should behave and what you should do. They don't listen well, and in this case, you know, despite, I'm sure, all the entreaties of Ambassador McCallum to explain that we have no choice but to abide by the terms of the extradition treaty, they still believe that, you know, if they put enough pressure, that the Prime Minister will concede and at some point call the judge and say, you know, get Mrs. Meng to the airport and back to China, and this is not simply not possible.
Do you think if, for example, she is released eventually, that the pressure will abate, or do you anticipate that this is the beginning of something bigger?
Well, it's difficult to guess. If she were to be released on bail, that would be, from the Chinese side, I think, well received. But the problem is that the legal process that will lead to her extradition, or eventual extradition, could drag on for some time, which means that it will be more time to put pressure on Canada. And I think that the Chinese will have no qualms but to inflict some economic damage as well, just to make sure that we get the message.
Do you think that other Canadians, for example, in China, are at risk right now?
Well, you know, there's a word of caution that is on the website of Global Affairs to travelers. You know, you exercise caution when you are there. And there's always the risk that if you are involved in a legal dispute that you could be detained. In fact, we have a few businessmen who are in that situation right now who cannot leave China until the problem with their Chinese partner is resolved.
But for example, if you're a former diplomat, Canadian diplomat in China right now,
yeah,
should you be worried?
Well, I think you have to wonder, because you know, diplomats get into all kinds of activities that you know, the Chinese could assume are espionage. I recall when I was to China in my first posting in the 80s, I spoke Mandarin, so obviously I was a spy, and you know that you are always followed, your conversations are listened to, but there is a difference between doing your normal work as a political officer or an economic officer and being a spy. And I can tell you that Michael Kovrig is a great political officer, and none of his work would qualify, in my view, as espionage. But we will probably hear more from the Chinese authorities on this soon.
Do you think regular Canadians have any reason to worry about traveling there?
Well, I would hope that Canadian business people who work in China have not been involved into any corrupt activities or anything like this, because the Chinese have files. The way that they work, they have list of people. And so the Garrett obviously had been followed and watched for some time. And once Mr. Subin was arrested, they thought by arresting them that there could be a quid pro quo there. And so I would hope that for other people, they won't go after them, because if they were to, I think this would just send a chill in the business community. Already I've heard from some Canadian business people who are thinking that maybe it's better to wait after maybe the Chinese New Year to see where things are at that stage.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Saint-Jacques.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
We just heard from Canada's former ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, who says the detention of Michael Kovrig is no coincidence. If that's the case, what is Ottawa going to do next? Ralph Goodale is the Federal Minister of Public Safety, and he's here with me now. Hi, Minister Goodale. Nice
Hello.
to see you. Thanks
Nice
for coming in.
you.
Mr. Saint-Jacques said that he thought it was possible Mr. Kovrig is still a public service, that he was on leave, that he was on leave, but that he still is employed by the Government of Canada. Do you know if that's true or not?
I would have to check with Global Affairs as to whether his employment status continues. Obviously, he was recently an employee of the Government of Canada. My understanding is he had gone on to do other things in the private sector, in the NGO sector, still very much involved in Asia and China, and still a very active person with some profile.
We were also told that he performed a GRSP role, which sort of is a nexus between national security and a diplomatic function. Does the Government of Canada know if that has anything to do with this at all, or is a factor into all of this?
We are using every avenue of communication, diplomatic and otherwise, to find out just exactly what is going on here. This is deeply troubling when a Canadian suddenly, for no explicable reason, disappears. That is deeply, deeply worrying. So we are treating this with the gravity that it deserves. And Chrystia Freeland and her very proficient officials in global affairs, as well as the Prime Minister's office, are pursuing every avenue to find out exactly what has transpired here, where he is, what condition he is in. We're obviously anxious.
Do you know any of that information right now?
We don't at this stage. But obviously, when the Department of Global Affairs is in a position to comment on the detail, they will do so because they understand very much the public interest in his well-being.
Do you have any indication of whether his work, the type of work he did, though, as a civil servant or as a diplomat for Canada, had any kind of impact on the decision to detain him?
No one has connected those dots explicitly. That's what the detailed inquiries by Global Affairs and by the Prime Minister's office are trying to determine, as well as explaining emphatically the gravity with which Canada views this situation. Because to our knowledge, there is no rational explanation for his detention.
Is there an explicit link between the arrest of the CFO of Huawei and this detainment? Does the government perceive there is one?
We are determining those facts to see if this is some kind of a connected message. Certainly from our point of view, the actions that were taken last weekend, the detention and the bail procedure and so forth, that is entirely, in Canada, under our system, a rule of law country with due process, that is entirely independent of any kind of political involvement or engagement. The laws are applied independently by our judiciary and by our police services. They do what they are obliged to do under the law, and there is absolutely no political engagement or involvement in Canada.
China doesn't appear to understand that.
Well, we need to make sure they appreciate this point, and we will take every opportunity to make sure that this is understood. Obviously, their approach and their culture is different. Their tradition, their method of operating, but it's important in international relations to have a keen understanding of how countries behave themselves. And from the Canadian perspective, this is a totally non-political situation. It is rule of law, it is due process, and when you intervene politically, you undermine those absolutely critical values.
Has there been any communication between the Government of Canada and China's government since the news of Mr. Kovarik's detainment came to light?
Yes, indeed. The diplomatic connections have been established.
Have ministers spoken, or has the Prime Minister spoken to anybody?
Not to my knowledge. At the moment, the communication is flowing at the middle to senior diplomatic level.
Will that escalate? Should it?
We will take every step that's necessary to take to make sure that our message gets through.
Should
and that we protect the interests of Canadian citizens, including Mr. Kovarik.
Should Canadian citizens living in China, especially those who have worked as diplomats, be worried right now?
Well, you know, Global Affairs maintains a constant watch on risk levels and threat assessments around the world, of all kinds, whether that's a physical danger or a natural disaster or a weather problem or whatever. They monitor it all. And other agencies of the Government of Canada are involved in that as well. At the moment, to the best of my knowledge, they have not changed their advisory with respect to China, but they will obviously take all of these factors carefully into account. And if there is a good solid basis upon which to issue different advice to Canadians, Global Affairs will do that. They will not hesitate.
Is it being actively reviewed? Is the sort of travel advisory situation being actively reviewed because of what's happened?
When an incident like this occurs, you re-examine everything. Just as when there's a domestic security issue, the RCMP and CSIS and CSE and all of the CBSA, all of the other agencies check and double check and triple check everything to make sure that they know everything they need to know and they are making an appropriate assessment in the best interests of Canada. And undoubtedly in diplomatic circles, the same counterpart to that process takes place. This is deeply worrying, and we want to make sure that we do everything we possibly can do to look after the safety of this Canadian and to keep other Canadians away from the danger and out of harm's way.